You think you're looking at a timid nurse, someone forgettable, someone who flinches when a doctor raises his voice.
Move to
But
the ER now!
sometimes the quietest
Watch the
person
glass,
in the
keep
room
moving!
is the one who has
Vital
already
stable, almost
survived the
there.
worst day of everyone else's life. More than once. Every hospital has a heartbeat, a rhythm of organized chaos pulsing through fluorescent-lit corridors. At St. Jude's Medical Center in downtown Seattle, that rhythm was dictated by ego, hierarchy, and a strict, unspoken social food chain. At the very top sat the brilliant, sharp-tongued trauma attendings. At the bottom, blending into the sterile white walls like she was trying to disappear into them, was Clara Jenkins. Clara was 32, small-framed, pale, with hair perpetually pulled into a tight, unremarkable bun that made her look 10 years older than she was. She had transferred to St. Jude's 6 months earlier from an undisclosed facility back east. Her resume was frustratingly vague, mostly administrative nursing, or so the rumor mill claimed, because nobody had ever bothered to actually ask her. She didn't talk about her past. She didn't join the staff for after-shift drinks at Allie's pub. She didn't gossip in the break room about Dr. Richard Gallagher's impending divorce, or about charge nurse Brenda Hopkins' blatant favoritism toward the younger residents who flattered her. Because of her silence, the staff had diagnosed her with a terminal case of incompetence. "She's a mouse," Brenda would say, loud enough for Clara to hear while restocking the supply closet. I asked her to prep Trauma Bay 3 for a central line, and she just stared at the tray for a full minute before moving. It's like her brain operates on a delay. I don't know who she slept with on the board to get hired at a Level 1 trauma center, but she belongs in a suburban pediatric clinic, putting Band-Aids on scraped knees. Clara never defended herself. She kept her head down, her hands busy, her eyes sharp. What Brenda mistook for hesitation was actually meticulous, hyper-focused calculation. When Clara looked at a central line tray, she wasn't confused. She was running through a checklist in her head, adjusting the angle of the 14-gauge needle, calculating the exact placement of the sterile drape to shave off crucial milliseconds. But nobody noticed milliseconds. They only noticed flash and volume, and Clara had neither. At night, alone in a small rented apartment 3 blocks from the hospital, she noticed something else entirely. The silence. She would sit at her kitchen table with a single lamp on, staring at the wall, waiting for her hands to stop remembering things her mind had tried to forget. Sometimes she dreamed about sand and diesel smoke. Sometimes she dreamed about a boy no older than 19, asking her if he was going to make it home, and she still didn't know, 6 months later, whether she had told him the truth or just what he needed to hear in his final minute. She told herself this was the trade she had made. Anonymity for peace. A smaller life for a quieter one. She had wanted the mundane, the pettiness of missing turkey sandwiches in the staff fridge, the soap opera drama of who liked who at the nurse's station. She wanted a world where the stakes didn't involve the smell of burning jet fuel or the frantic, blood-curdling screams of a boy missing both his legs. She told herself, most nights, that she had earned this. She told herself that she was allowed to put it all down. But trauma has a funny way of finding the people who know how to dance with it. Dr. Richard Gallagher, chief of trauma, was the worst offender. He was, by any honest measure, a brilliant surgeon. Fast hands, sharp instincts, a resume that made hospital boards salivate. But his arrogance had calcified over the years into something almost structural, like it held up the rest of him. He viewed nurses not as colleagues but as tools, instruments to be picked up, used, and put back exactly where he'd found them. And in his eyes, Clara was a blunt scalpel, barely worth keeping in the drawer. "Jenkins, are you physically capable of moving faster than a glacial pace?" Gallagher barked one Tuesday afternoon, shoving past her to reach a patient with a mild concussion. "If you can't handle the heat, go restock the linens. Leave the medicine to the adults." Clara took a slow, measured breath. Her expression didn't change. "Yes, doctor, the patient's vitals are stable, but his pupil reactivity is sluggish on the left. I'd recommend a CT scan to rule out an epidural hematoma." Gallagher stopped and turned, looking at her the way you'd look at a chair that had suddenly spoken. He let out a short, patronizing laugh. "Thank you, WebMD." He bumped his head on a steering wheel at 10 miles an hour. "He's drunk, not dying. Push 50 of Zofran and discharge him." Clara didn't argue. She never argued. She documented her observation in the chart, carefully, precisely, the way she documented everything, because somewhere underneath the silence was a woman who had learned that paperwork could be the only thing standing between a mistake and a man's life. She administered the anti-nausea medication. She watched the patient wheel away. 2 hours later, that same patient was rushed back into the ER, actively seizing from a brain bleed. Gallagher swooped in like a storm front, barking orders at the residents, calling for an emergent craniotomy, playing the hero in front of a room that needed one. He saved the man's life. Clara never denied that. But not once, not for a single second, did he glance toward the quiet nurse standing at the edge of the chaos, the one who had called it 2 hours earlier and been told to mind her place. That night, Clara sat in the stairwell on her break, alone, and let herself cry for exactly 4 minutes. Not for the insult, she told herself, but for the version of herself that used to be listened to. Then she wiped her face, fixed her bun, and walked back onto the floor like nothing had happened. It was easier, she had decided long ago, to let them believe she was slow and timid. The mask was a kind of armor. Nobody asks a mouse hard questions. Nobody asks a mouse to relive anything. The shift started like any other late October Friday. A heavy Seattle drizzle battered the reinforced glass of the emergency room doors. The ER hummed along at its usual lazy pace. Brenda at the main desk, complaining loudly about her alimony payments to anyone who'd listen. Gallagher flirting with a pharmaceutical rep near the telemetry monitors, his charm switched on like a light fixture. Clara quietly inventorying the crash cart in Trauma Bay 2, lining up the epinephrine syringes with the kind of care most people reserve for things they're afraid of breaking. At 3:14 p.m., the red emergency phone on the wall screamed. It wasn't the hospital's normal ring. It was the high-pitched, relentless wail reserved for a code triage, a mass casualty event. Brenda snatched the receiver, and the color drained from her face in real time. The entire ER fell silent, the ambient noise of chatter and beeping monitors suddenly swallowed by the gravity of one phone call. "How many?" Brenda's voice cracked. "Oh my God! Yes, we're initiating protocol now." She slammed the phone down and hit the overhead PA. "Code triage. All hands to the ER. Multi-vehicle pileup on Interstate 5. A logging truck lost its load across the median, hit a commuter bus and 6 passenger cars. EMS reports at least 30 casualties. First buses arriving in 4 minutes." The mundane shattered instantly. The hospital transformed around them like a held breath finally released. Gallagher clapped his hands, snapping into command mode. "All right, listen up. Clear all bays. Page ortho, neuro, cardiothoracic. Brenda, you're running triage at the doors. Greens to the waiting room, yellows to the hallway, reds straight to me." His eyes landed on Clara, crouched by the crash cart. "Jenkins, get out of the trauma bays. You'll freeze up and get in the way. Go to the waiting room, hand out warm blankets. Leave the real work to the trauma team." Brenda smirked, tossing a stack of clipboards onto the desk. "You heard him, Clara. Blankets and clipboards. Don't mess it up." Clara didn't argue. She picked up the clipboards and walked toward the waiting room, her face perfectly neutral. But underneath the surface, something old and familiar was stirring. A low, icy calm sliding into place behind her ribs, the same feeling she used to get in the seconds before a convoy rolled out. She hated how easily it still came back to her. She hated, more than that, how much it felt like relief. 4 minutes later, the automatic doors blew open and the war zone arrived. The screaming hit first. A chaotic symphony of agony. The high-pitched wails of injured children. The deep, guttural groans of men in shock. The frantic shouting of paramedics trying to be heard over each other. Stretchers rolled in one after another, leaving trails of muddy rainwater and bright red blood across the pristine white linoleum. Blunt force trauma to the chest, BP 80 over palp, Heart rate 140. A paramedic yelled, shoving a gurney past Brenda. Bay 2. No, wait, Bay 3. We need a chest tube setup, Brenda shouted back, visibly drowning, the lobby filling faster than her mind could sort it. Clara stood near the waiting room doors, arms full of blankets, watching the chaos with the clinical detachment of someone who had seen far worse in far hotter places. Her eyes moved from patient to patient, automatically sorting, automatically labeling, the way she used to before she'd had time to think about whether she wanted to. Tension, pneumothorax, left side, flail chest, severed femoral artery, tourniquet applied but slipping. Then her eyes locked onto a patient being rolled into the overflow hallway, a young man in his 20s, wearing a torn business suit, his tie still somehow knotted at his throat. He wasn't screaming. He was eerily quiet. His skin was pale, his lips tinged blue. A junior paramedic bagged him with shaking hands, his face the color of old paper. "What do we have here?" Gallagher asked, striding past on his way to a louder, more dramatic patient. "John Doe, found trapped under the bus," the paramedic stammered. "Hypotensive, 70/40, pulse weak. Gave him 2 liters of saline, no response, probably internal bleeding." "Give him O-neg, put him in the queue," Gallagher said, already walking away. "I've got a crushed pelvis in Bay 1. Clara dropped the blankets. The clipboards clattered against the floor. She didn't ask permission. She bypassed Brenda, who was mid-argument with an EMT, and walked straight to the gurney, her steps quick and certain in a way no one at St. Jude's had ever seen. She pressed 2 fingers to the young man's neck. The pulse fluttered weak and thready beneath her fingertips. She leaned down, ear near his chest, muffled heart sounds. She checked his neck, jugular venous distension, the veins bulging like something pressing up from beneath the skin. She glanced at the monitor the paramedic had hastily clipped on. Low blood pressure, muffled heart sounds, distended neck veins, Beck's triad. A textbook sign of cardiac tamponade, blood filling the sac around his heart, slowly crushing it, squeezing the life out of an organ that didn't know how to defend itself. Without intervention, he would arrest in under 2 minutes. He didn't have time to wait in any queue. "Get me a pericardiocentesis kit," Clara said. Her voice wasn't the usual soft whisper the staff knew her by. It was sharp, low, and absolute, the kind of voice that made the young paramedic flinch like he'd been slapped awake. "What?" he asked, blinking at her. "Now! And bring an ultrasound if you have one, but I can do it blind if I have to. 18-gauge spinal needle, 50cc syringe." She was already ripping open his shirt, splashing betadine across his chest in quick, practiced strokes. "Hey!" Brenda's voice cut through the noise, her footsteps fast and furious. "Jenkins, what do you think you're doing? Dr. Gallagher said he waits for the OR. Step away from the patient." "He doesn't have time for the OR," Clara said, not looking up, eyes locked on the rapidly fading numbers on the monitor. "He has a pericardial tamponade. He's going to code." "You don't make diagnoses, Clara." Brenda grabbed her arm hard. "You're a nurse, a glorified receptionist. Step away before I have security drag you out." Clara ripped her arm free with a sudden controlled violence that made Brenda stumble backward into silence. "If you touch me again," Clara said, her voice flat and cold, "I'll break your wrist." She turned back to the patient without missing a beat. Needle. Now. The commotion had drawn Gallagher's attention. He stormed over from Bay 1, his scrubs soaked in someone else's blood, his face purple with fury. "Jenkins, have you lost your goddamn mind?" His voice carried down the hallway, drawing every eye in range. "I gave you a direct order to hand out blankets. This is practicing medicine without a license." "I'm saving a dying man," Clara said, tearing open a syringe packet without looking up. "His heart is being crushed by fluid. He needs decompression." Gallagher laughed, a harsh, disbelieving bark. "You're going to do a blind pericardiocentesis in a hallway? You can barely string an IV bag without staring at it for 5 minutes. You'll puncture his myocardium and kill him instantly." He turned, scanning the chaos. "Security! Get her out of here now!" Two large security guards, hearing the chief of trauma shouting, began pushing through the crowd of stretchers toward her. That was the moment the monitor let out a long, continuous tone. Flatline. "He's coding," the young paramedic shouted, panic cracking his voice. "Move, Jenkins!" Gallagher lunged forward, suddenly understanding, a half-second too late, that the quiet nurse had been right the entire time. But Clara was already moving. She didn't hesitate. She didn't shake. Her hands operated on a muscle memory forged somewhere far worse than a brightly lit Seattle hallway. She drove the needle just below his xiphoid process, angling it toward his left shoulder with a precision that came from 1,000 repetitions she had never told anyone about. She pulled back on the plunger. Dark, non-clotting blood rushed into the syringe. The monitor beeped. Once, twice, and then a steady rhythm returned, climbing, strengthening. The blue tint drained from the young man's lips like color seeping back into a photograph. Gallagher froze mid-stride. Brenda's jaw hung open. The security guards stopped in their tracks. For one suspended moment, the entire corridor seemed to hold its breath, the chaos of the disaster outside fading to background static. Clara secured the needle, locked a stopcock into place, and finally looked up at Gallagher. The timid mouse they thought they knew was gone from her face entirely. Her eyes were hard, calculating, and utterly without fear. "Pressure relieved. Vitals stabilizing," she said, her voice deadly calm. "He's ready for your OR now, doctor." Before Gallagher could find a single word to say, the walls began to vibrate. It started as a low rumble, a deep, rhythmic thumping that rattled the surgical instruments on their metal trays. The sound grew until it drowned out even the sirens outside. "What the hell is that?" Brenda gasped, looking up at the ceiling. It wasn't the hospital's civilian life flight chopper. This was heavier, angrier, the unmistakable roar of twin turboshaft engines. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the rain whipped into a violent frenzy as a massive matte black MH-60M Black Hawk, unmarked except for a subdued medical cross and a military serial number, descended like something out of a war they'd only ever seen on the news. It landed directly on the street outside the ER doors, ignoring the helipad on the roof entirely. The downdraft was so violent it shattered 2 reinforced glass panes in the lobby, sending a spray of safety glass skittering across the floor. The ER went silent except for the roar of rotor blades. Gallagher stumbled back. Who called the military?" The side doors of the Black Hawk slid open, and 3 men in tactical gear and heavy combat armor stepped out, carrying a Stokes basket stretcher between them. They didn't wait for hospital staff. They kicked through the shattered glass and stormed into the ER like they owned it. Leading them was a towering man with a scarred face, an assault rifle slung across his back, and a frantic, searching look in his eyes. "Who is the senior medical officer?" he bellowed over the dying whine of the rotors. Gallagher straightened, trying to reclaim some shred of authority. "I'm Dr. Richard Gallagher, Chief of Trauma. You can't just land that thing." The man ignored him entirely. His eyes swept past Gallagher, past Brenda, and landed on the small, pale woman standing by the hallway gurney, her hands still slick with the stranger's blood. The frantic look in his eyes dissolved into something closer to relief than Clara had ever seen on another human face. He didn't address the chief of surgery. He didn't address the charge nurse. He stood at attention in the middle of the St. Jude's ER and looked directly at the woman everyone else had spent 6 months calling invisible. "Major Jenkins," he said, his voice carrying through the stunned silence like it had been waiting 6 months to say her name out loud. "Thank God we found you. We have a critical situation. You're the only one who can save him." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Not even the sirens outside or the groans of the injured could break through it. Every eye in the room turned to the small, unassuming woman standing in the wreckage of shattered glass, blood drying on her hands. Gallagher's jaw worked soundlessly. He looked from the heavily armed operative to the nurse he had mocked 5 minutes earlier. "Major," he finally managed, his voice cracking. What kind of joke is this? She's a junior nurse. She doesn't even have ACLS certification on file. The scarred operative didn't so much as glance at him. His attention stayed locked on Clara. Major Jenkins, it's Captain Elias Ford. We caught an ambush during extraction near the border. Shrapnel to the upper left quadrant, heavy arterial bleed. Our medic took a round to the helmet. He's out cold. We tried clamping, but we're losing him. Medevac surgeons at Lewis McCord are 20 minutes out. Ford has maybe 5. General Harrison said if anyone could pull him back, it's the ghost. Clara stood perfectly still. For 6 months, she had buried this version of herself so deep she'd almost convinced herself it had died somewhere in the desert with everyone else she couldn't save. Major Clara Jenkins, the most decorated forward-deployed trauma surgeon in U.S. Special Operations Command. After a deployment in Syria that ended in a mass casualty event where she operated for 48 straight hours under mortar fire, with 2 of her own team members bleeding out under her hands before she could even get to them, she had simply walked away. Not dramatically, not with paperwork and ceremony. She had just stopped showing up to be Major Jenkins, and started showing up instead as a quiet nurse who didn't speak much and didn't ask for much, because both of those things felt safer than being needed again. JSOC had granted her an indefinite sabbatical, on one condition. They always knew exactly where she was. She looked down at her blood-stained hands, then over at the young man on the gurney whose life she had just pulled back from the edge with nothing but a needle and a steady hand. The mundane hospital noise around her seemed to fade into something distant, replaced by the old familiar grip of combat triage settling back over her chest like a coat she hadn't worn in a long time, but still somehow fit. "I'm not that person anymore, Thomas," she said softly. Her voice carried more weight than the words alone should have held. Sergeant First Class Thomas Brody stepped closer, his combat boots leaving bloody tracks across the pristine linoleum. "Clara." His voice dropped, quieter now, just for her. "It's Elias. He pulled you out of that burning striker in Raqqa. He didn't quit on you that day. Don't quit on him now." Something in Clara's face shifted. Not panic, not fear, but the particular ache of a debt she had never stopped carrying. She remembered the heat of that vehicle, remembered Elias's hands dragging her clear seconds before it went up, remembered promising herself in that moment that she would never let a debt like that go unpaid if she ever got the chance to repay it. Brenda, who had been hiding half behind the nurse's station this entire time, finally found her voice. "Clara. What is happening? Who are these people?" Clara didn't answer her. She closed her eyes, took one slow breath, and when she opened them again, the timid wallflower of St. Jude's Medical Center was gone. What looked back at Brody now were the eyes of a woman who had fought the worst the world had to offer in the dirtiest, most broken corners of it and had come out the other side. Tired, but not beaten. "Is his chest cavity open?" she asked, her voice cracking like a whip. "Negative," Brody said, already stepping aside to clear her path. "Packed it with quick clot, but pressure's dropping. 60 over palp. I need a field thoracotomy kit, 3 units of whole blood, O negative, and a headlamp. Get the bird spooled up." Clara turned and walked straight toward Gallagher, who instinctively took a step back from a woman half his size. "Dr. Gallagher," she said, her voice stripped of the deference she'd worn like a disguise for 6 months. "My patient has a stabilized pericardial window. He needs a surgical washout and a pericardial drain immediately. If you botch the closure and he dies, I will personally see to it that your medical license is shredded. Do you understand me?" Gallagher, pale and sweating, could only nod. "Yes. Yes. Good." She didn't wait for more. She didn't look at Brenda, frozen at the desk, or the other nurses staring at her like she was a stranger wearing a familiar face. She stripped off her blue St. Jude's scrub top, revealing a tight black undershirt, and grabbed a trauma jump bag off the wall rack. "Let's go, Sergeant," she said, and vaulted through the shattered window frame into the torrential rain without a single backward glance. The downdraft of the Black Hawk whipped her hair loose from its tight bun, dark strands lashing across her face as she climbed into the helicopter's belly. The smell hit her instantly. Jet fuel, copper, wet tactical gear, and something in her chest cracked open at how familiar it felt. How much, despite everything, it still smelled like home. The interior was a nightmare of dim, red, tactical lighting and deafening noise. Pinned to the vibrating floorboards was Captain Elias Ford, his uniform cut away from a mangled ruin of torn flesh and dark, pooling blood. Another operative knelt beside him, pressing both hands desperately into his collarbone in a futile attempt to slow the bleeding. "Talk to me," Clara shouted over the roar of the engines as the helicopter pitched hard, banking to avoid the Seattle skyline. "Heart rate 140, weak. He's going hypovolemic," the operative yelled back. Clara dropped to her knees on the slick floor. No sterile field, no overhead lights, no anesthesiologist standing by. Just red emergency lighting, turbulence, and a man she owed her life to bleeding out beneath her hands. "He's bleeding from the subclavian artery. It's retracted into the chest cavity," she said, fingers probing the raw edge of the wound. "Quick clot isn't holding. I have to open him and clamp it from the inside." A clamshell thoracotomy inside a violently bouncing helicopter was close to a death sentence under the best circumstances. One slip of the scalpel and she would sever his aorta instead of saving him. "Hold him down," Clara ordered. "If he thrashes, he dies." Brody and the other operative pinned Ford's shoulders and hips to the floor. Clara drew a number 10 scalpel from her kit. She didn't hesitate. One fluid, brutal motion, a massive horizontal incision below the pectoral muscle. The helicopter dropped through an air pocket, but her hands stayed perfectly steady, moving independently of the chaos around them, the way they always had. She wedged the heavy metal rib spreaders into the incision and cranked them open with a sickening crack of bone. The chest cavity was a swamp of blood. She couldn't see the artery. She had to find it by feel alone. She plunged her bare hands into the hot, pulsing wreck of his chest, bypassing the beating heart, fingers searching up toward the clavicle for the mechanical thrum of the severed vessel. The helicopter banked sharply again, throwing her against the bulkhead. She grunted in pain but didn't pull her hands free. "There," she breathed. "Got it. Clamp." Brody slapped the heavy surgical clamps into her outstretched hand. She guided it down along her own fingers, locked it onto the retracted artery, and clamped it shut. The welling blood slowed to a sluggish weep. "Pressure's rising," the operative on the monitor shouted. 75 over 50, 80 over 60. He's stabilizing." Clara slumped back against the vibrating wall of the fuselage, her arms painted crimson to the elbow, her chest heaving. She looked down at Elias's pale face under the red light, watching his breathing settle into something shallow but steady. For a moment, just a moment, she let herself feel it. Not pride, not relief, but something closer to grief for the version of herself that had once done this every single day and called it normal. She pressed her forehead briefly to her own wrist and let one breath shake on the way out before she straightened her spine again. The ghost had pulled him back from the ledge. Again. 20 minutes later, the Black Hawk touched down on the secured tarmac at Joint Base Lewis McChord. A team of military surgeons and nurses swarmed the aircraft before the rotors had even finished powering down, loading Captain Ford onto a gurney and rushing him toward the base hospital at a dead run. An older man, wearing the stars of a major general, walked out onto the wet tarmac, ignoring the rain soaking through his uniform. He found Clara sitting on the edge of the helicopter floor, an exhausted silhouette against the dim red cabin light, her hands still dark with someone else's blood. "Welcome back to the land of the living, Major Jenkins," General Harrison said, his voice grave but warm with something like relief. "You saved one of my best men today," he added. Clara wiped a streak of blood from her forehead with the back of her wrist, her hand trembling slightly now that there was finally nothing left for it to do. "He needed a surgeon, General, not a ghost." "Are you ready to come back to us, Clara?" he asked. Not as an order, she noticed, as a question. Maybe for the first time in either of their careers, an actual question. Clara looked out over the wet tarmac, the floodlights, the distant hangars, and then down at her own blood-soaked hands. She thought about St. Jude's, the pettiness, the arrogance, the small mundane dramas of a civilian world that had no idea what real monsters looked like, or how heavy it was to carry the knowledge of them alone. She thought, too, about the boy in Syria she still dreamed about, the one whose name she had never let herself forget, even when she'd tried to forget everything else. "Give me a week," she said finally, standing, "to get my affairs in order." She paused, something almost like a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth for the first time in 6 months. "But first, I need a ride back to Seattle. My shift doesn't end until 7. 2 hours later, the automatic doors of the St. Jude's emergency room slid open. The chaos of the pileup had settled into a grim, exhausted quiet. Staff moving sluggishly, cleaning blood off floors that would need to be cleaned again tomorrow and the day after that. Clara walked in wearing a fresh set of military fatigues, courtesy of the base, her boots clicking sharply against the tile in a way her old sneakers never had. The entire ER went still. Brenda dropped a stack of charts. Gallagher, just stepping out of the OR, froze mid-step. His eyes went from Clara's face to the silver oak leaves pinned at her collar, and something in his expression cracked open. Clara walked calmly to the nurse's station, picked up her clipboard, and looked at Brenda as though nothing in the world had happened. "I believe I was tasked with handing out blankets, Brenda. Are we still short in the waiting room?" Brenda opened her mouth. No sound came out. She just stared, pale and silent. Gallagher took a hesitant step forward, his arrogance stripped away like a coat left out in the storm. "Major, Clara, the patient you stabilized. He survived surgery. Your call was flawless." He swallowed. "I owe you an apology. We all do." Clara looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Long enough that he started to understand, maybe for the first time, what it had cost her to stand there silently for 6 months while he humiliated her in front of an entire department. She didn't yell. She didn't gloat. She offered him a faint, tired smile instead, the kind that holds no malice, only distance. "Keep your apology, Dr. Gallagher," she said softly, turning toward the locker room. "Just remember, the next time you decide to mock the quiet ones in the room, you never know what kind of war they've already won." She didn't leave St. Jude's that week, or the week after. General Harrison had asked her to come back, and some part of her, the part that still woke up some mornings reaching for a rifle that wasn't there, knew that she eventually would. But not yet. Not without finishing something first. On her last night before her sabbatical officially ended, Clara stayed late after her shift, sitting alone in the same stairwell where she used to cry for exactly 4 minutes and then put her mask back on. This time, she didn't cry. She just sat, listening to the building breathe around her, gurneys rolling, monitors beeping, the small mundane heartbeat of a world that had no idea how close it had come, more than once, to losing people it never even knew were in danger. She thought about the boy in Syria again. She let herself say his name out loud, once, quietly, into the empty stairwell, something she had never let herself do anywhere else. It didn't fix anything. It didn't bring him back. But it felt, for the first time in a long time, like putting something down instead of burying it. If the story of Major Clara Jenkins proves anything, it's this. True brilliance rarely needs to shout to be heard, and the people who survive the worst things in life are very often the ones who learn to carry it the most quietly. You should never judge a person by how loud they are in the room. Sometimes the quietest ones are carrying the loudest storms, and sometimes, if you're lucky, you get to watch them choose, one more time, to walk back into the fire for someone else. If you liked this story, please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and press the bell icon so that more heartfelt stories like this reach you first. Thank you.